Hello everyone. Today, Biker Justice Analyst bring you a story full of humanity and compassion. Enjoy listening.
Hell's Angel stopped his bike. When he saw a child crying on the road, but what he was carrying changed everything. The Montana sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples as gray Hawk Dawson guided his Harley down the empty back road. Dust kicked up behind his wheels, creating a golden haze in his mirrors. The familiar rumble of his bike beneath him was the only sound for miles across the vast prairie landscape. His weathered hands, covered in faded tattoos, gripped the handlebars with the ease of someone who'd spent more time on two wheels than off them. Each mile marker that passed brought back memories of his years with the Hells Angels, some that made him grimace, others that made his chest tighten with regret. The wind whipped at his leather jacket, well worn from countless rides. His long gray hair, tied back in a neat ponytail, danced in the breeze. At 58, every line on his face told a story, and most weren't the kind you'd share in polite company. Hawk's mind drifted to his last night with the club, 15 years ago. The flames, the screams, the choice he made that changed everything. He'd saved that rival gang member from the fire, breaking every code he'd lived by. It had cost him his brothers, his identity, everything he thought mattered. But it had also given him something he didn't know he needed, a chance to be something different. These lonely back roads had become his sanctuary since then. Out here, with nothing but prairie grass and big sky surrounding him, he could almost forget the weight of his past. Almost. The setting sun cast long shadows across the asphalt, stretching like dark fingers across his path. His bike purred steadily as he leaned into a gentle curve. The tall grass on either side of the road swayed in the evening breeze, creating waves of golden movement that reminded him of the ocean he'd seen once, long ago, before the gang became his whole world. There were nights when the silence out here was so complete, it felt like a physical presence. Tonight, though, something was different. Something was off. Hawk had learned to trust his instincts. They'd kept him alive when nothing else would. He eased off the throttle slightly, his senses alert. The road ahead stretched empty and quiet, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there moments before. The changing light played tricks with the shadows, making shapes dance at the edges of his vision. Then he heard it. So faint at first he thought he was imagining things. A sound that didn't belong out here in the middle of nowhere. A sound that cut through the steady rumble of his engine and straight to something deep inside him he thought he'd buried years ago. Sobbing. A child sobbing. Hawk twisted the throttle back, slowing his bike. The sound grew clearer, desperate, exhausted crying that no child should ever make. He guided his Harley to the shoulder of the road, gravel crunching under his tires as he came to a stop. There, barely visible in the fading light, stood a small figure by the roadside. A boy, couldn't be more than 7, with dirty, bare feet and tears streaming down his face. But what made Hawk's breath catch in his throat wasn't just the boy. It was what the child held in his trembling arms. A baby, wrapped in what looked like a thin blanket, tiny and vulnerable against the vast Montana landscape. The boy stared at Hawk with wide, terrified eyes, clutching the baby tighter to his chest. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. Hawk cut the engine, letting silence settle over the empty road. The boy's sobs grew clearer now, mixing with the soft evening breeze. Standing beside his bike, Hawk's weathered boots crunched against the gravel as he took a cautious step forward. The boy stumbled backward, his small arms tightening around the bundle he carried. His bare feet were dirty and scraped, his clothes wrinkled and stained. Tears had carved clean trails through the dust on his cheeks. "Easy there, kid," Hawk said softly, keeping his distance. He held up his hands, palms out, trying to look less threatening despite his tattooed arms and leather vest. "I'm not going to hurt you." The child sniffled, studying Hawk with red-rimmed eyes. The bundle in his arms stirred, and a tiny whimper emerged. "That's your baby?" Hawk asked, his voice gentler than it had been in years. The boy shook his head. "My sister." His voice was barely a whisper. "Her name's Rosie. I'm Mason." Hawk nodded slowly, noticing how Mason's arms trembled from the weight of carrying his sister. "Where's your mama, Mason?" Fresh tears welled up in Mason's eyes. "She won't wake up," he choked out. "I tried and tried, but she won't wake up. It's been 2 days." His lower lip quivered. "I ran out of formula for Rosie. She's hungry." Hawk's chest tightened. He'd seen enough in his life to know what "won't wake up" probably meant. He crouched down to Mason's level, keeping his movements slow and steady. "How far have you walked?" Mason shrugged his thin shoulders. "A long time. Since morning." He looked down at his sister, who was wrapped in what appeared to be a baby blanket. "Rosie's getting heavy." Hawk glanced at his bike, then back at the road stretching empty in both directions. The sun was sinking fast, and the temperature would drop soon. These kids wouldn't survive another night out here. "Listen, Mason," Hawk said, choosing his words carefully. "There's a town about 20 minutes that way." He pointed down the road. "Would you let me take you there? Get some food for your sister?" Mason's eyes widened with fear. "Mom said never to go with strangers." "Your mom was right," Hawk agreed. "But sometimes we need help, even from strangers." He pulled out his wallet and showed Mason his ID. "My name's Gray Dawson. People call me Hawk. Now I'm not a stranger anymore." Mason looked at the ID, then at Hawk's face, then down at his crying sister. His young face showed a battle between fear and desperation. Will you help Rosie?" Mason asked finally, his voice small but hopeful. "Yes," Hawk answered simply. After a moment's hesitation, Mason nodded. Hawk approached slowly and carefully took Rosie from Mason's tired arms. She was light, too light, and fussy from hunger. He removed his leather vest and wrapped it around her tiny body. The fluorescent lights of May's all-night diner buzzed overhead as Hawk settled into a worn vinyl booth, carefully holding baby Rosie against his chest. Her tiny body felt impossibly fragile against his weathered leather vest. She'd fallen asleep during the ride, her sweet face peaceful despite everything. Mason slid into the seat across from him, his bare feet barely touching the floor. The boy's eyes darted nervously around the nearly empty diner, but they kept coming back to Hawk with a mix of fear and hope. "You need to eat something, kid," Hawk said quietly, trying to soften his naturally gruff voice. He'd forgotten how to talk to children, if he'd ever known at all. A tired-looking waitress approached, her name tag reading Betty. She eyed Hawk's tattoos and vest with obvious concern, but managed a professional smile. "What can I get you folks?" "Chocolate milk?" Mason asked tentatively, looking at Hawk. Hawk nodded. "Chocolate milk for him, and—" He studied the boy's thin face. "Better bring a burger and fries, too. I'll have coffee, Black." When Betty walked away, Mason leaned forward, squinting at Hawk's vest. "Are you really an angel?" Hawk nearly choked. He glanced down at his Hell's Angels patch, worn and faded from years on the road. "No, kid. I'm just—" He trailed off, unsure how to explain. "But you helped us," Mason insisted, "and you're wearing angel wings." He pointed to the winged skull emblem. "Mom said angels watch over good people. Maybe God sent you to help us?" The words hit Hawk like a physical blow. He hadn't thought about God in decades, not since his own childhood prayers had gone unanswered in foster homes and juvenile detention centers. Betty returned with their drinks and food. Mason's eyes widened at the sight of the burger, and he began eating quickly, like someone might take it away. "Slow down there," Hawk cautioned. "Nobody's gonna steal it." Rosie stirred in his arms, making tiny snuffling sounds. Without thinking, he gently rocked her, the way he'd once seen mothers do. She settled again, her tiny hand clutching his vest. "Sir?" Betty approached their table again, wringing her hands nervously. "Is everything okay here?" Hawk met her worried gaze. He knew what they must look like. A rough biker with 2 children who clearly weren't his. He opened his mouth to explain, but what could he say? The bell above the diner door chimed. Sheriff Buckley stepped in, his uniform crisp despite the late hour. Hawk tensed instinctively, years of running, from the law kicking in. But he stayed put, conscious of the sleeping baby in his arms and the frightened boy across from him. Mason's face went pale. He scrambled out of his seat and around the table, pressing against Hawk's side. "Please don't let them take us away," he whispered. "Please, Angel." The sheriff approached slowly, one hand resting casually on his belt. His eyes took in everything: the sleeping baby, the half-eaten burger, Mason's bare feet, Hawk's vest. "Evening," Buckley said quietly. "Mind if we have a talk about these children?" Mason's fingers dug into Hawk's arm. "Don't let them take us to the foster place," he pleaded. "Mom said never to go there, please." Hawk felt the weight of Rosie in his arms, heard the terror in Mason's voice, and remembered his own childhood fears. He looked up at the sheriff, keeping his voice steady. "We can talk, but the kids stay with me while we do." Sheriff Buckley's office was small but tidy, with worn leather chairs and faded photographs of Montana landscapes on the walls. Hawk sat stiffly, his weathered hands gentle as they cradled sleeping Rosie. Mason hadn't left his side, pressed close against his leather vest. "So, you found them on Route 12? Sheriff Buckley settled behind his desk, his blue eyes sharp but not unkind. "Yes, sir." Hawk's voice was gravelly from years of hard living. "Boy was standing there holding his sister. Couldn't just leave them." The sheriff nodded slowly, studying Hawk's face. "You know, you look familiar. Took me a minute, but I remember now. About 5 years back, there was this story that made the rounds. Biker pulled a man from a burning wreck out on Highway 89. Never stuck around for thanks. That was you, wasn't it?" Hawk shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "News got that?" "Sure did. Fellow you saved was a father of 3. He still tells that story." Buckley leaned forward. Said a man covered in tattoos appeared like an angel out of nowhere, pulled him clear just before the car exploded. Mason's eyes went wide. "See? I told you he was an angel." A ghost of a smile crossed Hawk's weathered face, but before he could respond, the office door opened. A woman in her early 40s entered, carrying a well-worn briefcase. Her brown hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore practical shoes that had seen better days. "I'm Dana Torres from Child Protective Services," she announced, taking in the scene with practiced eyes. Her gaze lingered on Hawk's tattoos and leather vest before shifting to the children. "Ms. Torres," Sheriff Buckley nodded. "These are the Carter children I called about, Mason and Rosie." Dana pulled up a chair, her movements efficient and professional. "Mason, honey, can you tell me where your mama is?" Mason pressed closer to Hawk. "She wouldn't wake up. I tried and tried. Then the food was all gone, so I had to take Rosie and find help." Dana's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "We'll send someone to check. On your mother. Right now, we need to find you and your sister a safe place to stay." I want to stay with Hawk, Mason said quickly. He's protecting us. I understand you feel safe with him, Dana replied, opening her briefcase. But there are procedures we have to follow. We have a wonderful foster family who can take both you and your sister tonight. No. Mason's cry was sharp and sudden, making Rosie stir in her sleep. He wrapped his arms around Hawk's waist, tears streaming down his face. Don't let them take Rosie! Don't let them take me! The desperation in the boy's voice made Hawk's chest tighten. He found himself putting a protective arm around Mason, feeling the child's small body trembling against him. Dana Torres watched this interaction with a mixture of sympathy and professional detachment. Mr. Dawson, I need you to help us make this transition easier. These children need proper care in a certified foster home. Mason's grip on Hawk only tightened, his tears soaking into the leather vest. Please, he begged, looking up at Hawk with red-rimmed eyes. Don't let them take us. Please. Dana Torres drummed her fingers on the metal desk, studying the forms in front of her. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead, making the late hour feel even more surreal. She looked up at Hawk, her expression a mix of professional concern and personal doubt. Mr. Dawson, you understand this is highly irregular, she said, sliding the temporary custody papers across the desk. 72 hours is all I can give you while we locate suitable placement. Hawk's weathered hands, covered in faded tattoos, picked up the pen. His fingers, usually so steady on motorcycle handles, trembled slightly. I understand, ma'am. Mason sat nearby, his small hand clutching Rosie's blanket while she dozed in a borrowed car seat. His eyes never left Hawk, watching each movement as if afraid the big man might disappear. You'll need to provide proper sleeping arrangements, Dana continued, her voice clipped and professional. Food, clean clothes, basic necessities. There will be a home visit tomorrow morning. Sheriff Buckley leaned against the wall, arms crossed. I can vouch for Gray here. He's got a solid roof over his head up on Cedar Mountain. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's always paid his taxes on time. Dana's eyebrows rose slightly at the sheriff's unexpected support. She turned back to Hawk. Any history of substance abuse? Been clean 15 years, Hawk answered quietly. Don't even keep beer in the house anymore. Mason piped up suddenly, his voice small but determined. He's good, I can tell. Mom always said I was good at knowing good people. The mention of their mother brought a heavy silence to the room. Dana sighed, then pointed to various lines on the forms. Initial here, here, and here. Full signature at the bottom. Hawk's large hands moved carefully across the paper, his signature surprisingly neat for someone with such rough appearance. Each scratch of the pen felt like another link in a chain he wasn't sure he was ready for, but something in Mason's trust made it impossible to walk away. Here's my card, Dana said, holding out a simple white business card. Any problems day or night, you call immediately. I mean it, Mr. Dawson. Any problems at all? The drive to his cabin was quiet, with Mason finally giving in to exhaustion in the back seat of Sheriff Buckley's patrol car. The sheriff had insisted on giving them a ride, since Hawk's motorcycle wasn't exactly family transportation. Rosie slept soundly in her car seat, occasional tiny snores breaking the silence. When they arrived, Hawk carried them both inside his small cabin. The place was sparse but clean, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. He'd lived simply here for years, finding peace in the isolation. Now, watching Mason curl up on the couch near the freshly lit fire, that solitude felt like a lifetime ago. He placed Rosie gently in the center of his bed, building a barrier of pillows around her tiny form. The baby sighed in her sleep, one small hand clutching the edge of his quilt. Moving back to the main room, he found Mason had already drifted off, his face peaceful in the firelight. Hawk stood there, his massive frame casting long shadows in the dim light. The weight of responsibility settled over him like a heavy blanket. These children, so vulnerable and trusting, were now in his care. Him, a man who'd spent years running from any real connection, whose past was filled with shadows he'd rather forget. Looking at their sleeping faces, he whispered into the quiet cabin, "What have I gotten myself into?" The first rays of sunlight filtered through the cabin's dusty windows, painting streaks across Hawk's weathered face. He hadn't slept, keeping watch over the children from his old leather armchair. Rosie's soft whimpers pulled him from his thoughts. Mason stirred on the couch, rubbing his eyes. "She's hungry," he said matter-of-factly. "Mom always gave her formula in the morning." Hawk ran a calloused hand through his graying hair. The reality of caring for a baby hit him like a freight train. No formula, no diapers, nothing but motorcycle parts and old memories in this cabin. "All right, kids," he said, his gravelly voice gentler than usual. "Guess we're making a supply run." Getting them ready wasn't easy. He wrapped Rosie in his cleanest t-shirt, making a makeshift diaper that wouldn't last long. Mason's clothes were dirty from their journey, but they'd have to do for now. The old Harley wouldn't work, not with two kids. In the back of his garage, under a tarp, sat his backup vehicle, a rusted '85 Ford pickup he used for parts runs. It groaned to life after 3 tries. "It sounds sick," Mason observed from the passenger seat, holding Rosie carefully. "Just needs some love," Hawk replied, surprising himself with the softness in his voice. "Like all of us, I guess." The bell, above Wilson's pharmacy door, chimed as they entered. The morning regulars, mostly elderly folks getting prescriptions, stopped mid-conversation. Their stares burned into Hawk's tattooed arms as he cradled Rosie against his leather vest. Mrs. Wilson herself, who'd run the place for 30 years, peered over her cat-eye glasses at the strange sight. Hawk could read the judgment in her eyes. What was a man like him doing with these children? "Formula's in aisle 3, she said curtly. "Diapers in 4. Mason stuck close to Hawk's side as they navigated the narrow aisles. The boy seemed to sense the tension, his small hand gripping the edge of Hawk's vest. "Which kind did your mama use?" Hawk asked, staring at the wall of formula containers. "The blue one," Mason pointed, "with the happy baby on it." They filled their basket with diapers, wipes, and other necessities Mason helped identify. Hawk grabbed some proper children's clothes, too, guessing at sizes. The total made him wince, but the emergency cash he kept in his boot would cover it. Standing in the checkout line, Rosie started to fuss. Without thinking, Hawk swayed gently, patting her back the way he'd seen mothers do. The movement felt foreign to his battle-scarred hands. But Rosie settled, nuzzling into his chest. "Well, I'll be damned." The soft voice behind him stopped his heart. He knew that voice, would know it anywhere. It had haunted his dreams for 15 years. Hawk turned slowly, coming face to face with Edie Marshall. Time had been kind to her dark hair now streaked with elegant silver, laugh lines around her eyes deeper but still beautiful. She wore a pastor's collar now, something that would have seemed impossible in their wild younger days. Her eyes moved from his face to the baby in his arms, then to Mason, who was half hidden behind him. The surprise on her face melted into something softer, more complex. "Didn't think I'd see you again, Gray," she said softly, using the name only she had ever called him by. The small cafe was nearly empty when Hawk slid into the booth across from Edie, careful not to wake Rosie, who dozed against his chest. Mason sat beside him, coloring on a paper placemat with crayons the waitress had brought over. Edie's gentle eyes hadn't changed, Still that same warm brown that had once made him feel safe. She wore a simple cross necklace now, and her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun. The years had been kind to her. "So," she said softly, stirring her coffee, "want to tell me how a retired Hell's Angel ended up with 2 little ones?" Hawk shifted uncomfortably, one hand automatically moving to support Rosie's back as she snuffled in her sleep. "Found them on Route 12 yesterday. Their mama—" He glanced at Mason and lowered his voice. "She passed. Boy was carrying his sister walking down the road." Mason looked up from his coloring. "He's my angel," he declared proudly. "See his wings?" He pointed to the worn leather vest, hanging on the hook beside their booth. Edie's eyes misted slightly. "Is that right?" She smiled at Mason before turning back to Hawk. "Social services gave you temporary custody?" 72 hours, Hawk grunted, trying to sound detached. "Just till they find somewhere proper for them." "And you're managing okay? With supplies, I mean?" "Got the basics. Formula, diapers." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable with the discussion of baby items. "I still have some of my niece's old things in storage. Crib, changing table. They're yours if you need them." She paused, then added quietly, "I never stopped praying for you, Gray. All these years." Hawk stared down at his untouched coffee. "Waste of good prayers, Edie." "God doesn't waste prayers," she replied firmly, "and he doesn't make mistakes. Maybe you were meant to find these children." Before Hawk could respond, Rosie stirred and whimpered. He automatically started swaying slightly, the motion natural despite his bulky frame. The baby settled, her tiny fingers clutching his shirt. Later that night, back at the cabin, Mason sat cross-legged on his makeshift bed near the fireplace. "Can you tell me a story?" he asked, as Hawk tucked the blanket around him. Hawk froze. "Don't know any proper stories, kid." "Make one up?" Mason's eyes were hopeful in the firelight. Hawk settled onto the floor beside him, watching Rosie sleeping peacefully in the middle of his bed, surrounded by pillows. "Well, I had this dog once. Name was Shadow." "What kind of dog?" "Big old mutt. Black as night. Found him hurt by the side of the road, kind of like—" He cleared his throat. "Anyway, Shadow had this funny habit. Every morning he'd steal one of my boots and hide it somewhere different." Mason giggled. "Did you find them?" "Sometimes took hours. Once found it in the bathtub. Another time up in a tree. Still don't know how he managed that one." Hawk found himself smiling at the memory. "Shadow was clever that way. Used to bring me things he thought I needed, like he was taking care of me." From the bed, Rosie let out a soft laugh in her sleep, as if she was sharing in their moment. Mason's eyes were getting heavy, but he fought to keep them open. "What happened to Shadow?" "Lived to a ripe old age. Stayed with me 14 years. Hawk's voice grew softer. "Loyal till the end." Hawk woke to Rosie's urgent cries, different from her usual morning fussing. Her tiny face was flushed pink, and when he touched her forehead, heat radiated from her skin. His heart raced as memories of past emergencies flooded back. But this wasn't a wounded biker brother. This was a helpless baby who needed him. "Mason," he called out, his voice rougher than intended. "Get your shoes on, quick!" The boy scrambled up from his sleeping bag, rubbing his eyes. "What's wrong with Rosie?" "She's burning up." Hawk wrapped Rosie in a soft blanket, his large hands trembling slightly as he tried to be gentle. He'd patched up countless wounds in his time, but this felt different, more frightening somehow. The morning air was cool as they rushed to his truck. Hawk had never been so grateful for trading in his Harley as he carefully secured Rosie's car seat. The drive to the clinic seemed endless, even though it was only 10 minutes away. In the rearview mirror, he could see Mason holding his sister's tiny hand, whispering comfort. The clinic's waiting room was mercifully empty when they arrived. The receptionist took one look at Hawk's worried face and Rosie's flushed cheeks and buzzed them straight through. Dr. Sarah Chen, a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, examined Rosie with practiced ease. "How long has she had the fever?" she asked, checking Rosie's gums. "Just noticed it this morning," Hawk replied, hovering nearby. Will she be okay?" Dr. Chen smiled. "She's teething. See these swollen spots?" She pointed to Rosie's gums. "It's causing a low-grade fever, which is completely normal. You did the right thing bringing her in, though. Better safe than sorry with little ones." Relief flooded through Hawk's body. He hadn't realized how tense he'd been until his shoulders finally relaxed. "Actually," Dr. Chen continued, "I'm impressed with how well cared for she is. Clean, good weight, no diaper rash. You're doing a great job." Hawk felt his throat tighten at the unexpected praise. "I'm just temporary," he mumbled, but his hand instinctively stroked Rosie's soft hair as she whimpered. "Here's a teething ring," Dr. Chen said, pulling one from a drawer. "Keep it in the fridge. The cold will help with the pain. Children's Tylenol for the fever. I'll write down the proper dosage. And don't be surprised if she's extra clingy. Teething's rough on babies." Mason tugged at Hawk's leather jacket. "See? I told you angels know how to take care of babies." Hawk felt his face flush as Dr. Chen raised an eyebrow, but she just smiled and finished writing her instructions. They walked out of the clinic into the bright morning sun, Rosie already calmer with the cool, teething ring in her mouth. That's when Hawk spotted the familiar government-issued sedan across the parking lot. Dana Torres sat behind the wheel, her face partially hidden behind large sunglasses as she wrote in her ever-present notebook. Hawk pulled Rosie closer to his chest, feeling the warmth of her small body against his heart. He didn't need to see what Dana was writing to know that every move he made was being scrutinized, every decision questioned. The weight of judgment felt heavier than any chain he'd ever worn. The afternoon sun filtered through the cabin's dusty windows as Hawk rummaged through his workshop. His rough hands, more used to fixing motorcycles than building furniture, carefully measured and cut pieces of wood. Mason sat cross-legged nearby, watching with curious eyes. "What are you making?" Mason asked, scooting closer. "Something for your sister to sleep in," Hawk replied, his voice gentler than usual. "Can't have her rolling off the bed." He worked methodically, transforming old wooden crates and spare lumber into a sturdy little crib. The familiar smell of sawdust filled the air, reminding him of younger days working in his grandfather's shop. Mason handed him tools when asked, beaming with pride at being helpful. "You're pretty good at building stuff," Mason said, running his hand along the smooth edge of the crib rail. Hawk grunted in response, but a small smile tugged at his lips. "Years of fixing things teaches you a thing or two." In the kitchen, a pot of chicken soup simmered on the old stove. Hawk had found the recipe scribbled in an ancient cookbook left by the cabin's previous owner. The aroma of herbs and vegetables filled the small space, making it feel more like a home than it had in years. "Want to learn something useful?" Hawk asked, leading Mason to the stone fireplace. He crouched down, his leather vest creaking. "Winter's coming. You should know how to build a proper fire." Mason nodded eagerly, mimicking Hawk's movements as they arranged kindling and small logs. Hawk showed him how to create a teepee with the wood, explaining each step with patience he didn't know he possessed. "See these little pieces of bark? They catch easier than the big stuff. Always start small," Hawk demonstrated, striking a match. The kindling caught quickly, and Mason's eyes widened with delight as the flames grew. "It's like magic!" Mason exclaimed. Hawk chuckled. Not magic, kid. Just science and know-how. While Rosie napped in her new crib, they ate soup at the worn kitchen table. Mason swung his legs, chattering about his favorite superhero movies. Hawk found himself actually listening, asking questions, drawn into the child's imaginative world. The day passed with surprising ease. Hawk taught Mason how to wash dishes properly, and together they organized the cabin's sparse supplies. It felt natural, almost peaceful, a feeling that both comforted and unsettled him. As evening settled in, Hawk heated a bottle for Rosie, while Mason held her on the couch. The boy's devotion to his sister touched something deep inside him, something he thought had died long ago. Later that night, Hawk emerged from his workshop where he'd been organizing tools. The cabin was quiet except for the crackling fire. He stopped in the doorway, struck by the sight before him. Mason lay sprawled on the old leather couch, fast asleep. Rosie was nestled securely in his arms, her tiny hand clutching her brother's shirt. Their faces were peaceful in the firelight, trust written in their relaxed features. Hawk moved silently across the room, his boots making no sound on the wooden floor. He carefully pulled the worn, quilted blanket from the back of the couch and spread it over them both. His calloused hand hovered for a moment over their heads, then gently tucked the blanket around their shoulders. Standing there in the firelight, watching these two, small souls sleep, Hawk felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. It wasn't the burning anger he'd carried for so long, or the numbing chill of loneliness. This was something different, something that made his heart feel too big for his rib cage. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's dusty windows as Edie's pickup truck rumbled up the gravel driveway. Mason peered through the window, his small hands pressed against the glass. "Who's that?" he asked, turning to Hawk, who was attempting to feed Rosie her morning bottle. "That's Pastor Edie," Hawk said, his voice gruff but gentle. "Better see what she wants." Edie stepped out of her truck wearing a flowered dress and carrying a basket of fresh muffins. Her silver hair caught the sunlight as she walked toward the cabin's entrance. "Good morning," she called through the screen door. "I brought breakfast and an invitation." Hawk opened the door, still cradling Rosie. "An invitation?" "The town picnic is this Sunday after service. Games for the kids, food, music, the works." She smiled at Mason, who was hiding behind Hawk's leg. "There's even going to be a carousel this year." "I don't think that's—" Hawk started. "Please?" Mason tugged at Hawk's jeans. "Can we go? I've never been on a carousel." Hawk shook his head. "Those folks don't want someone like me around." Edie's eyes softened. "Greyhawk Dawson, you've been carrying old wounds long enough. These children are showing you a new path. Maybe it's time to let the town see who you really are." Mason darted outside suddenly, spotting something in the grass. "Look, flowers!" He began picking the wild daisies that dotted the lawn. "Can we give these to Miss Edie?" Hawk watched as Mason gathered a handful of slightly crushed flowers, presenting them to Edie with pride. Her face lit up as she accepted them. "These are beautiful, Mason. Thank you." She tucked one behind her ear, making the boy giggle. Hawk felt something shift inside him as he watched their interaction. Maybe Edie was right. Maybe it was time. "All right," he said finally. "We'll come. But just for a little while." Sunday arrived with perfect weather. Hawk parked his truck at the edge of the town square, his heart pounding as he helped Mason and Rosie out. The smell of barbecue and fresh-baked pies filled the air. Children ran around with balloons, while adults set up games and food tables. Mason spotted the tug-of-war setup immediately. "Can I try, please?" Before Hawk could answer, a group of kids Mason's age waved him over. To Hawk's surprise, their parents didn't pull them away. Instead, they helped organize the teams. "Go ahead," Hawk said, adjusting Rosie on his hip. Mason ran off, grinning. The children's tug-of-war became the afternoon's highlight. Mason's team, despite being smaller, pulled with all their might. When they won, Mason's victory whoop echoed across the square. He ran back to Hawk, red-faced and beaming. Did you see? Did you see us win?" Later, they found the carousel. Hawk held Rosie securely on a painted horse, walking alongside as it turned. Her delighted squeals drew smiles from everyone nearby. For the first time, the looks thrown his way weren't fearful or judgmental. As the afternoon wore on, Edie brought over a slice of apple pie and sat with them at a picnic table. Other townspeople gradually joined, making small talk about the weather and complimenting Mason's tug-of-war victory. Someone passed Hawk another piece of pie. He couldn't remember the last time he'd shared a meal with anyone besides the children. Looking around the table at the genuine smiles, at Mason chattering with new friends, at Rosie contentedly playing with a balloon, Hawk felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: belonging. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Hawk's yard as his axe split another log with a satisfying crack. Sweat trickled down his tattooed arms, but the work felt good, purposeful. He glanced over at Mason, who sat in the dirt nearby, pushing a rusty toy truck through makeshift roads he'd carved with a stick. Vroom, vroom. Mason made engine sounds, completely absorbed in his play. The sight made something warm stir in Hawk's chest. He'd found the old truck in a box of forgotten things in the cabin's storage room. Mason's eyes had lit up when Hawk handed it to him, as if it were made of gold instead of dented metal. Setting another log on the chopping block, Hawk thought about the picnic earlier. The memory of Rosie's delighted squeals on the carousel played in his mind. He remembered how natural it felt, holding her steady on the painted horse, while Mason waved from the one in front. "Need some help, Hawk?" Mason called out, abandoning his truck to toddle over. Hawk smiled, something he found himself doing more often lately. "These logs are bigger than you, buddy, but you can help stack the split ones if you want." Mason nodded eagerly, his small hands gathering the smaller pieces. Hawk watched him work, marveling at how the boy took such pride in helping. Inside the cabin, Rosie napped in her makeshift crib, really just a drawer from an old dresser, padded with blankets. Hawk had reinforced it himself, making sure it was sturdy enough. After finishing with the wood, Hawk led Mason inside. The cabin's interior was still rough, but it was changing. He'd swept away decades of dust, fixed the squeaky floorboards, and patched the worst of the roof leaks. The place smelled less like old leather and motorcycle oil now, more like baby powder and the pine-scented cleaner Edie had recommended. "Mason, hand me that box from the corner," Hawk said, pointing to a weathered cardboard box he hadn't opened since moving in 15 years ago. Mason dragged it over, curious as Hawk knelt and opened the flaps. Inside, wrapped in an old t-shirt, was a silver frame holding a faded photograph. "Who's that lady?" Mason asked, peering at the image. Hawk's throat tightened. "That's my Mama," he said softly, running his thumb over the glass. In the photo, she was young and beautiful, her smile bright despite the hardships he knew she'd faced. She wore a simple dress, her hair caught in the wind of some forgotten summer day. "She's pretty," Mason said. "Where is she now?" Hawk swallowed hard. "She's with the angels, buddy." He stood, still holding the frame, and walked to the stone fireplace. For a moment, he just stared at the mantel, remembering all the years he'd kept this photo hidden away, too angry and hurt to look at it. But now, with Mason's small presence beside him and Rosie's soft breathing from across the room, something felt different. Maybe it was time to make peace with the past. Carefully, he placed the photo on the mantel, adjusting it until it sat just right. His mother's smile seemed to warm the whole room, like she was giving her blessing to whatever this new chapter might become. "I think she would have liked you kids," Hawk said quietly, more to himself than to Mason. A small hand slipped into his large, calloused one. "I think she would have liked you too, Hawk," Mason said with that simple wisdom children sometimes have. The aroma of beef stew filled the small cabin as Edie stirred the pot on Hawk's old stove. She'd brought fresh bread and insisted on helping with dinner, showing Hawk how to make a proper meal that wasn't from a can. Mason sat at the kitchen table, carefully coloring a picture while Rosie played with wooden blocks on a blanket nearby. "Miss Edie, you make the best bread ever," Mason said, his mouth full of the warm roll she'd given him as a pre-dinner snack. "Thank you, sweetheart. My grandmother taught me how." She glanced at Hawk, who was awkwardly trying to set the table with mismatched plates he'd scrounged up. "Though I think your guardian angel here could use some cooking lessons." Hawk grunted, but there was a hint of a smile on his weathered face. "Been getting by just fine on my own cooking all these years." "Beans from a can isn't cooking," Edie teased, her eyes twinkling. Mason looked up from his coloring, his expression serious. "Is Miss Edie your girlfriend, Hawk?" The question made Hawk nearly drop the stack of plates he was holding. His face reddened beneath his graying beard. "No, kid. Miss Edie's just an old friend." "But she comes over lots now," Mason persisted, "and she makes us food and helps with Rosie." He tilted his head. "Don't girlfriends do that?" Edie laughed softly, stirring the stew. "Sometimes they do, Mason. But sometimes friends do those things too, just because they care." "Oh." Mason seemed to consider this. "Well, maybe she could be your girlfriend someday." Hawk cleared his throat roughly, but Edie just smiled, her eyes meeting his across the kitchen. "Maybe someday," she said quietly. "God has a way of working things out exactly as they should be." They ate dinner together, the warmth of good food and conversation filling the usually quiet cabin. Edie showed Mason how to dip his bread in the stew broth, and even managed to get Rosie to eat more than usual, making airplane noises with the spoon that had the baby giggling. After the kids were tucked in, Hawk and Edie sat on the cabin's small front porch. The Montana night spread out before them, stars scattered across the dark sky like diamond dust. "You've changed, Gray," Edie said softly, using his real name. "I see it more every day." Hawk stared out into the darkness. "Don't know about that." "I do." She turned to face him. "The man I knew years ago wouldn't have stopped for those children, wouldn't have opened his home, his heart." "That man was running," Hawk interrupted, his voice rough. "Still am, maybe." "No." Edie reached over and touched his arm, her fingers light against his leather jacket. "You're not running anymore. You're building something here, and you were never as bad as you believed yourself to be. I always saw the good in you, even when you couldn't see it yourself." Hawk was quiet for a long moment, his shoulders tense. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm scared, Edie. Scared I'll mess this up. Those kids, they deserve better than an old biker who can barely keep his own life straight." "Those kids love you," Edie said firmly. "And love isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to be there day after day. That's what you're doing." The morning sun cast long shadows across Hawk's property as he stepped out onto the cabin's worn wooden porch. The crisp Montana air filled his lungs as he surveyed his surroundings, a habit ingrained from years on the road. Something felt off. That's when he saw them. Fresh tire tracks cutting through the morning dew on the grass, leading right up to his property line before turning around. They weren't from his bike or Edie's car. Someone else had been here. Hawk's muscles tensed as he followed the tracks, examining the deep treads in the soft earth. Whoever it was had come late last night, probably while they were all sleeping. The thought made his stomach turn. Inside the cabin, Mason was helping Rosie with her breakfast, carefully spooning cereal into her mouth. The sight would usually warm Hawk's heart, but now it filled him with a different kind of emotion. Fear. "Mason," Hawk said carefully, keeping his voice steady. "Did your daddy ever drive a blue pickup truck?" The spoon in Mason's hand clattered to the table. His face went pale, and Rosie started crying at the sudden noise. How did you know?" Mason whispered, his small hands beginning to shake. Hawk crossed the room in 3 quick strides, picking up Rosie and placing a gentle hand on Mason's shoulder. "Just asking, buddy. Everything's okay." But Mason's eyes had already filled with tears. "He found us, didn't he? He's going to take us away." "Nobody's taking you anywhere," Hawk said firmly, though his own heart was racing. He needed to call Sheriff Buckley. 20 minutes later, the sheriff's cruiser pulled up to the cabin. Mason and Rosie were playing in the back room, but Hawk could see Mason keeping watch through the window, his young face etched with worry. "Tell me everything you know about their father," Hawk said as soon as Buckley stepped onto the porch. The sheriff's usually calm face was grim. "Dale Carter. Just got out of state prison 3 days ago. Did 5 years for aggravated assault and drug trafficking." Hawk's jaw tightened. "The kids never mentioned him." "Probably too scared to," Buckley said, his voice low. "He's got a history of domestic violence. Their mama had a restraining order against him, but..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "But what?" "But he never cared much for legal papers." "Look, Hawk," Buckley leaned closer. "Dale Carter is dangerous, real dangerous. The kind of man who thinks his kids are property, not people." Hawk glanced through the window at Mason, who quickly ducked out of sight. "He's not getting near them." "I've already put out an alert," Buckley said. "But you need to be careful, real careful. Carter's unpredictable, and he's got nothing left to lose." The sheriff pulled out his notebook and wrote down a number. "This is my personal cell. Any sign of him, day or night, you call me immediately." Hawk took the paper, his weathered fingers closing around it tightly. The tire tracks suddenly seemed more ominous, like a snake's trail leading right to their door. "I mean it, Hawk," Buckley emphasized, his eyes serious. "This isn't the kind of situation where you handle things the old way. These kids need you thinking clear." Through the window, Hawk could hear Rosie's happy babbling and Mason's quiet voice reading her a story. The sound made his chest ache with a fierce protectiveness he'd never felt before. "I hear you," Hawk nodded, though his old instincts were screaming for action. "I hear you loud and clear, Sheriff." The Montana night wrapped the cabin in darkness, broken only by pale moonlight filtering through the pines. Hawk sat on the front porch, his weathered hands resting on his knees. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made him tense. Inside, Mason and Rosie slept peacefully, unaware of their guardian's vigil. The old rocker creaked beneath him as he shifted his weight. His eyes never stopped scanning the tree line, searching for movement in the shadows. The weight of his past hung heavy tonight. Years of watching his back in the club had taught him the calm before a storm. A flash of movement caught his eye. Before he could react, something whistled through the air. The crash of breaking glass shattered the night silence. Hawk was already moving, his body operating on instinct honed from years on the streets. Inside, Mason bolted upright in bed. "What was that?" "Stay there," Hawk commanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He checked on Rosie first. She was still asleep in her makeshift crib, undisturbed by the noise. Glass crunched under his boots as he approached the broken window. A rock lay on the floor, wrapped in paper. His hands didn't shake as he unfolded the note, but his jaw clenched when he read the words scrawled in messy handwriting. "Give me what's mine." Mason appeared in the doorway, clutching his stuffed bear. "Is it him? Is it Dad?" Hawk's heart twisted at the fear in the boy's voice. He crossed the room and knelt before Mason, placing his large hands on the child's shoulders. "Listen to me, buddy. Nobody's going to hurt you or Rosie, not while I'm here." "Promise?" "I promise." Hawk pulled Mason into a tight hug, feeling the boy's racing heartbeat against his chest. After settling Mason back in bed, Hawk made a quick call to Sheriff Buckley, keeping his voice low. The sheriff promised to send a patrol car, but warned it would take time to reach the remote cabin. Hawk knew better than to wait for help. He'd learned long ago that sometimes you had to be your own cavalry. Moving quietly through the cabin, he began gathering essentials. He pulled out his old military duffel bag from under his bed, a remnant from his time in the service before the Hells Angels. Into a smaller backpack, he packed Mason's few clothes and Rosie's diapers. Formula, bottles, and some snacks went in next. He added Mason's bear and Rosie's favorite blanket, comfort items that might help keep them quiet if they needed to move fast. As he worked, memories of his own childhood rushed back. Nights spent listening to his mother's boyfriends pound on their door, learning to keep a bag ready by the window. He'd sworn he'd never let another child feel that fear, yet here he was, packing emergency bags in the dead of night. Hawk checked his wallet. Enough cash to get by for a while if needed. He added his important papers and the children's temporary custody documents. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him as he realized how much these kids had come to mean to him in such a short time. He stored the bags by the back door, out of sight, but ready to grab at a moment's notice. Then he resumed his watch, this time from inside, positioned where he could see both the front yard and the children's sleeping forms. His hand rested near the phone, ready to call Edie if things got worse. The night stretched ahead, long and uncertain. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Hawk parked his Harley in front of the small law office. Mason held Rosie close, his eyes darting nervously at every passing car. The events of last night's broken window still had them all on edge. "It's okay, buddy," Hawk said softly, placing a protective hand on Mason's shoulder. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." The law office was cramped and smelled of old paper and coffee. Framed diplomas covered the walls, and a desktop fan whirred quietly in the corner. Attorney Jim Patterson, a balding man with kind eyes and reading glasses perched on his nose, shuffled through the paperwork Hawk had brought. The bell above the door chimed, and Edie walked in, still wearing her pastor's collar. She squeezed Hawk's arm gently before sitting down beside him. "So," Patterson began, removing his glasses, "you're seeking legal guardianship of both children?" He glanced at Mason, who was bouncing Rosie on his knee in the corner of the room. "That's right," Hawk replied, his voice gruff but determined. "Their mother's—" He paused, looking at Mason. "She's gone, and their father isn't fit." Patterson leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "Mr. Dawson, I'll be straight with you. Without blood relation, this is an uphill battle. The courts generally prefer family members or certified foster parents." "But he is family," Mason suddenly piped up from his corner. "He takes care of us better than anybody ever did." Edie reached over and squeezed Mason's hand. "Honey, why don't we take Rosie outside for some fresh air?" She guided both children out, leaving Hawk alone with the lawyer. Patterson's expression softened. "Look, your background. The Hells Angels history. It's going to make things complicated. The judge will need convincing that you've changed." Hawk's jaw tightened. "Changed? I pulled those kids off the side of the road when nobody else would stop. I've been feeding them, clothing them, keeping them safe." "I understand that," Patterson said, raising his hands. "But we need more. Character witnesses, proof of income, a suitable living environment. The system wants stability." "Stability?" Hawk's voice rose slightly. "You mean like their father showing up in the middle of the night throwing rocks through windows?" Patterson started writing notes. "Document everything, every threat, every interaction. We'll need it for the case." He paused, looking directly at Hawk. "And you'll need to clean up your property. Make it more family-friendly." Through the window, Hawk watched Edie helping Mason push Rosie in an old stroller someone had donated. His chest tightened at the sight. "Whatever it takes," he said quietly. "Just tell me what to do." The meeting continued with Patterson outlining requirements: background checks, home studies, character references. Hawk's head was spinning with legal terms when his phone buzzed. Dana's name flashed on the screen. His stomach dropped as he answered. "Hello?" Dana's voice was professional, but firm. "Mr. Dawson, I'm calling to remind you that the 72-hour emergency custody period expires today. I'll be coming by at 5 o'clock to collect Mason and Rosie." Hawk's fingers gripped the phone tighter. He looked out the window again at the children, at Mason's smile as he played with his sister. The thought of them being taken away made his chest constrict. "Dana, I'm at the lawyer's office right now. We're working on—" "5 o'clock, Mr. Dawson," she interrupted. "I'll see you then." The line went dead. Hawk sat there, the phone still pressed to his ear, as the fan whirred quietly in the corner, and the morning sun continued its slow climb across the sky. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Hawk's front yard as Dana's government-issued sedan pulled up, followed by 2 police cruisers. Mason, who had been playing with toy trucks on the porch, dropped them with a clatter and ran to Hawk's side. "They're here," Mason whispered, his small fingers gripping Hawk's leather vest. "Please don't let them take us." Hawk's jaw clenched as he watched Dana step out of her car, manila folder in hand. Her face was professionally blank, but her eyes held a hint of sympathy. The 2 officers flanked her, their hands resting casually on their belts. "Mr. Dawson," Dana called out, her heels crunching on the gravel. "The temporary custody period has expired. I'm here to take Mason and Rosie into state care." Inside the cabin, Rosie babbled happily in her makeshift playpen, unaware of the storm brewing outside. Hawk's chest tightened as he thought of the past 3 days. The bedtime stories, the shared meals, the simple joy of watching Rosie take wobbly steps while holding his fingers. "They're safe here." Hawk's voice came out rougher than intended. "I can take care of them." "I understand you've grown attached," Dana said, climbing the porch steps. "But without proper certification and a home study, we can't—" "No!" Mason screamed, wrapping his arms around Hawk's waist. "He's our angel. God sent him to us, please." The officers moved forward, their boots heavy on the wooden steps. One reached for Mason, while the other headed inside for Rosie. The baby's happy babbles turned to confused whimpers as unfamiliar hands lifted her. "Don't touch her," Hawk growled, taking a step forward, but Dana placed herself between him and the officer. "Mr. Dawson, please don't make this harder than it needs to be," she said firmly. "If you interfere, they'll have to arrest you." Mason's screams echoed across the yard as the first officer pried him away from Hawk. The boy kicked and thrashed, his face red with tears. "Hawk, please! Don't let them take us! Please!" Rosie, sensing her brother's distress, began wailing. Her tiny hands reached toward Hawk as the officer carried her past, and something in Hawk's chest shattered. He'd never heard such raw fear in a baby's cry before. "I'll fix this," he called out, his voice breaking. Mason, I promise, I'll find a way." But Mason's sobs only grew louder as the officers secured both children in Donna's car. The boy pressed his hands against the window, his mouth forming words Hawk couldn't hear. Rosie's pacifier fell from her mouth onto the gravel as she was placed in her car seat. Dana paused before getting into her car. "Mr. Dawson, I know your intentions were good, but the system exists to protect children. If you want to help them, do it legally." She handed him a business card. "Call this number. Start the certification process." Hawk stood rooted to the spot as the cars pulled away, Mason's tear-streaked face visible through the rear window until they disappeared around the bend. The silence that followed was deafening. Slowly, mechanically, he walked to where Rosie's pacifier had fallen. He picked it up, rubbing his thumb over the small rubber nipple. 3 days. Just 3 days, and these kids had somehow worked their way into his heart, past all his carefully built walls. Hawk sank onto his porch steps, still clutching the pacifier. His vision blurred as tears, foreign, unwelcome things he hadn't allowed himself in 4 decades, began to fall. His shoulders shook with silent sobs as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the empty yard in shadows. The autumn wind whipped through the parking lot of Mountain View Children's Shelter as Dale Carter paced back and forth, his weathered boots kicking up gravel. His hollow eyes darted between the building's entrance and his beat-up pickup truck. Hawk had been watching from across the street for hours, his gut twisted with worry. He knew Dale would show up eventually. The man's reputation for violence was well known in 3 counties. "They're my kids," Dale's voice boomed across the lot as he confronted a startled staff member. "I got rights." The shelter worker backed away, reaching for her phone. "Sir, you need to leave. There are proper channels." "Proper channels?" Dale spat on the ground. "I ain't asking permission." Hawk's boots crunched on the gravel as he crossed the street. "That's far enough, Dale." Dale spun around, his thin face stretching into an ugly grin. "Well, if it ain't the angel everyone's talking about." He squared his shoulders, hands balling into fists. "You got no business here, old man." "Those kids?" Hawk's voice was steady, controlled. "They're terrified of you. Mason told me what you did to their mother." "Shut your mouth!" Dale lunged forward, throwing a wild punch that Hawk barely dodged. The parking lot became their arena. Dale was younger, fueled by rage and whatever was running through his system. But Hawk had decades of experience. He blocked a second punch and landed one of his own, sending Dale staggering. "You abandoned them," Hawk growled, circling. "Left them with a dying mother." Dale charged like a bull, tackling Hawk into the gravel. They rolled, trading blows. Blood sprayed from Dale's nose. Hawk's lip split. The sound of sirens grew closer. "They're mine!" Dale screamed, landing a solid hit to Hawk's ribs. "My blood!" "Blood?" Hawk grabbed Dale's collar, pulling him close. "Blood ain't love. Blood ain't protection. Blood ain't sitting up all night with a teething baby or teaching a boy to tie his shoes." Police cars screeched into the lot. Officers poured out, weapons drawn. "Break it up! Hands where we can see them!" Both men were pulled apart, roughly handcuffed. Hawk could taste blood in his mouth as they pushed him into the back of a patrol car. Through the window, he saw Mason's face pressed against the shelter's glass door, tears streaming down his cheeks. The holding cell was cold and familiar. Hawk sat on the metal bench, refusing to speak to anyone. Hours passed. His ribs ached. His knuckles were raw. "Gray?" Edie's soft voice carried through the bars. She stood there in her pastor's collar, worry lines creasing her forehead. Hawk couldn't meet her eyes. "I failed them, Edie, just like I failed everyone else." "Look at me," she commanded. When he finally did, her gaze was fierce with conviction. "You stood between those children and a monster today. That's not failure. I'm in jail, again. He gestured at the cell. Some guardian angel I turned out to be. Edie stepped closer to the bars. You're meant to be their father, Gray. Not by blood, by choice. Her voice softened. Sometimes love looks like a fight worth having. Edie sat at her desk in the small church office, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. The morning light streamed through stained glass windows, casting colorful shadows across her determined face. She had to get this letter just right. In my 20 years as pastor, she typed, I've witnessed countless transformations, but none quite like Greyhawk Dawson's. The man who returned to our town carrying 2 desperate children is not the same man who left it decades ago. Down the street at the diner, Martha Wilson wiped down tables with one hand while scribbling her own letter with the other. That man came in here with 2 hungry kids, she wrote in her looping handwriting. Didn't have much money but made sure they ate first. When little Rosie spilled milk all over his leather jacket, he just laughed and cleaned it up. That's not the behavior of someone we should fear. Dr. Thompson added his medical perspective from his clinic office. The level of attention Mr. Dawson showed to both children's health needs was exemplary. When Rosie developed a fever, his concern and quick action demonstrated the instincts of a natural caregiver. Sheriff Buckley's official letter carried particular weight. While Mr. Dawson's past associations are well documented, his recent actions speak louder than any prior record. He's shown remarkable restraint in dangerous situations and consistently put the children's welfare first. The letters began piling up on Judge Henderson's desk. The pharmacist wrote about how Hawk had carefully studied baby formula labels to choose the best one. The grocery store owner described him teaching Mason to count change. The librarian detailed how he'd sit for hours while Mason picked out books, even though Hawk clearly felt out of place there. Even Dana, the social worker, found herself writing a careful amendment to her initial assessment. While unconventional, she noted, the bond between Mr. Dawson and the children is genuine and nurturing. Their distress at separation has been severe and telling. Edie collected the letters, each one a testament to the quiet ways Hawk had woven himself into the fabric of their community. She delivered them personally to the courthouse, praying they would make a difference. Meanwhile, in the children's temporary foster home, Mason sat cross-legged on his bed. His small face was scrunched in concentration as he pressed a red crayon to paper. The foster mother, Mrs. Parker, watched from the doorway as he carefully formed each letter. Dear Judge, Mason wrote, his letters wobbly but determined. My sister Rosie and me need to go home. Hawk is my angel. He makes the best peanut butter sandwiches and knows how to stop Rosie crying when she's scared at night. He taught me to make a fire safe and tells good stories about his old dog. Mason paused, chewing his lip. Mrs. Parker could see tears forming in his eyes, but he blinked them back and continued writing. Please don't make us leave him. He needs us too. He smiles now, and sometimes he sings when he thinks we're sleeping. God sent him to find us on that road. Please let us go home. He signed it simply. Mason Carter, with a small drawing of what looked like a motorcycle next to it. Mrs. Parker helped him address the envelope, her heart aching as she watched him carefully lick the stamp and place it in the corner. Together they walked to the mailbox at the end of the street. Mason stood on tiptoe to push the letter through the slot, then stayed there, small hand resting on the cold metal. Do you think it will help? He whispered. Mrs. Parker squeezed his shoulder gently. I think, she said softly, that sometimes the simplest words speak the loudest. The courtroom's wooden benches creaked under the weight of what seemed like half the town. Hawk sat stiffly in his pressed flannel shirt, his tattooed hands clasped tightly in his lap. His long gray hair was neatly tied back, and he'd trimmed his beard, small changes that spoke volumes about his determination to prove himself worthy. Mason and Rosie sat with their temporary foster mother a few rows back. Mason kept trying to catch Hawk's eye, waving whenever he managed to. Rosie, now walking unsteadily, kept pointing at Hawk and saying, "Da," until she was gently shushed. The proceedings began with the usual formalities, but the atmosphere shifted when Dana Torres took the stand. She smoothed her blazer, glancing first at her notes, then at Hawk, then at the children. "Your Honor," Dana began, her voice carrying a hint of unexpected emotion. "When I first met Mr. Dawson, I saw what everyone else probably sees, a former gang member with a troubled past. I was certain placing children with him would be a mistake." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I've never been happier to be wrong." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Hawk's shoulders tensed. In my 15 years as a social worker, I've rarely seen such a complete transformation. Mr. Dawson didn't just provide shelter, he created a home. He learned to change diapers, cook healthy meals, and most importantly, he gave these children something they desperately needed: unconditional love and stability. The judge, a stern-faced woman with silver-rimmed glasses, nodded thoughtfully. And the children's response to him? Mason and Rosie both flourished in his care. The night we removed them, Dana's voice cracked slightly. Well, I've never seen children so devastated to leave a temporary placement. That speaks volumes. After Dana, several townspeople testified. The pharmacy owner described how Hawk had studied baby formula labels for an hour to choose the right one. The doctor spoke about Hawk's middle-of-the-night concern over Rosie's teething fever. Sheriff Buckley detailed Hawk's cooperation and protective instincts. Then came the moment that brought tears to many eyes. The judge held up a wrinkled piece of paper covered in colorful crayon writing. "I'd like to read something into the record," she announced. "This is a letter from Mason Carter, age 7. She cleared her throat and began to read. "Dear Judge, Hawk is my angel. I know his vest says Hell's Angel, but that's old. He makes me feel safe. He teaches me things like how to make scrambled eggs and tie my shoes right. He never yells even when Rosie cries at night. He reads to us even though he says he's not good at it. Please let us go home. I promise to be good and help with Rosie. Hawk says family isn't about blood, it's about love. He loves us. We love him too. From Mason." The courtroom fell silent. Hawk wiped his eyes roughly with the back of his hand. The quiet was broken by Dale Carter bursting through the doors, still in his prison jumpsuit and shackles, escorted by 2 officers for his part of the hearing. His eyes were wild, his movements aggressive despite his restraints. "Those are my kids," he shouted. "You can't give them to this biker trash." The judge's gavel cracked sharply. "Mr. Carter, control yourself, or you'll be removed." She turned to his parole officer, who had stepped forward with a file. "Your Honor," the parole officer stated, "Mr. Carter has violated multiple conditions of his release, including making threats and attempting to contact the victims of his prior offenses. We're requesting immediate revocation of his parole." The judge studied the documents before her, then looked at Hawk, who sat straight and steady, his eyes never leaving Mason and Rosie. "After reviewing all testimony and evidence," she began, "I hereby grant temporary guardianship of Mason and Rosie Carter to Greyhawk Dawson, subject to review in 6 months." She turned to Dale. "And I'm ordering Mr. Carter's return to state custody for parole violations." The metal doors of the children's shelter swung open with a heavy clang. Hawk stood in the doorway, his weathered boots planted firmly on the threshold. His heart hammered against his ribs as he scanned the room, searching. "Hawk!" Mason's voice pierced the quiet. The boy burst from a side room, his sock-clad feet slipping on the linoleum floor as he ran. His small face was lit up with pure joy, tears streaming down his cheeks. Hawk dropped to one knee, his arms opening wide just as Mason launched himself forward, The impact nearly knocked him backward, but he held firm, wrapping the boy in a fierce embrace. Mason's thin arms locked around his neck, squeezing so tight it almost hurt. "I knew you'd come back," Mason whispered into Hawk's leather jacket. "I told Rosie you would. I knew it." A social worker appeared, carrying Rosie. The baby's eyes went wide at the sight of Hawk, and she immediately started bouncing in the worker's arms, reaching out with grabby hands. "Da, da!" she squealed, her whole body wiggling with excitement. Hawk's vision blurred as he stood, still holding Mason. He reached for Rosie with his free arm, and the social worker carefully transferred her over. The baby immediately pressed her face into his neck, her tiny hands patting his beard as she babbled happily. "Got your stuff ready to go?" the social worker said softly, holding up 2 small bags. "They didn't have much with them." Hawk nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Mason's legs were wrapped around his waist, and Rosie was snuggled against his chest. The weight of them both felt right, like coming home after a long journey. Through the shelter's front window, he could see Edie waiting by his old truck. She had insisted on driving him here, knowing his hands might be too full for the ride back. As he walked toward the exit, she stepped out of the truck, and he could see the tears glistening on her cheeks even from a distance. "Look who's here, kids," Hawk managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. "Pastor Edie came to welcome you home." Mason lifted his head from Hawk's shoulder, his face breaking into a wide smile. "Miss Edie," he called out, waving but not loosening his grip on Hawk's neck. Edie approached them, reaching out to smooth Mason's wild hair. "Welcome back, sweetheart," she said, then leaned in to kiss Rosie's chubby cheek. The baby giggled, reaching for Edie's cross necklace with curious fingers. They loaded into the truck, Hawk sitting in the back seat with both kids still clinging to him. Neither seemed willing to let go, and he wasn't about to make them. The drive home was quiet, except for Mason's occasional sniffles and Rosie's content babbling. Back at the cabin, Edie helped them inside while Hawk carried the kids. The familiar smell of home wrapped around them, wood smoke from the fireplace, pine from the forest outside, and now something new, the scent of pancakes cooking. "Thought we'd have a little celebration," Edie said, heading for the kitchen where she'd apparently been busy while Hawk was picking up the kids. "Breakfast for dinner. Mason told me once it was his favorite." Mason finally loosened his grip enough to look up at Hawk. "Can we really stay? Forever?" Hawk settled into his old armchair, both kids in his lap. He looked around at the cabin, at the toy trucks lined up on the windowsill, the makeshift crib in the corner, the crayon drawings taped to the walls. Then he looked at their faces, these 2 precious children who had somehow become his whole world. "We're home now," he said firmly, his voice thick with emotion. "For good." The autumn leaves painted the Montana hills in shades of gold and crimson as life settled into a gentle rhythm at Hawk's cabin. Each morning, he'd wake early to pack Mason's lunch for school, carefully cutting the crusts off his sandwiches just the way the boy liked them. The kitchen counter, once cluttered with motorcycle parts, now hosted a collection of superhero lunchboxes and baby bottles. One crisp morning, Hawk sat in his worn leather armchair, Rosie perched on his lap as he fed her breakfast. She'd grown so much in the past months, her baby cheeks filling out, dark curls sprouting wildly on her head. Mason sat cross-legged on the floor, proudly showing off his latest spelling test with a big red A marked at the top. "Look what Mrs. Thompson wrote," Mason beamed, pointing to a note at the bottom of the paper. "She says I'm the best reader in class." Hawk's chest swelled with pride. "That's my boy," he said, his gruff voice softening. "Smart as they come." Rosie squirmed in his lap, pushing away her spoon. She looked up at him with those big brown eyes that never failed to melt his heart. "Love you, Papa," she said clearly, reaching up to pat his stubbly cheek. The words hit him like a thunderbolt. The spoon clattered to the floor. Mason's eyes went wide with excitement. "She talked!" Mason jumped up. "Rosie said real words!" Hawk's throat tightened as he hugged Rosie close, breathing in her baby powder scent. He'd heard her babble Dada before, but this was different. This was everything. Later that afternoon, Hawk stood in his garage, running his hand along the chrome of his beloved Harley. The adoption lawyer's fees weren't cheap, and even with Edie helping to organize fundraisers in town, he was still coming up short. He'd been avoiding this moment, but Rosie's words that morning had made his decision crystal clear. The local mechanic, Joe, pulled up in his tow truck. He'd already agreed to buy the motorcycle, knowing what it meant to Hawk. The old biker watched as they loaded his Harley onto the flatbed, the sun glinting off its polished surface one last time. "You sure about this, Hawk?" Joe asked, counting out the cash. Hawk nodded, pocketing the money that would help make his family official. "Sometimes you gotta leave the past where it belongs." He drove into town in his newly purchased vehicle, a faded blue pickup truck with a few dents and a temperamental transmission. Mason sat in the middle of the bench seat, while Rosie was secured in her car seat by the window. The truck groaned as it climbed the hill toward their cabin. "It's not as cool as your motorcycle," Mason observed, running his hand along the cracked dashboard. Hawk chuckled, patting the steering wheel. "Maybe not, but angels can fly in these too." He glanced at his children in the golden afternoon light streaming through the windshield. "Besides, this way we all fly together." The truck backfired, making Rosie giggle and Mason jump. Hawk couldn't help but laugh, a deep, genuine laugh that seemed to come from somewhere he thought had long since gone quiet. The sound of their combined laughter filled the old truck's cabin as they headed home, the setting sun casting long shadows of a family finally complete. The youth shelter's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on the worn linoleum floor. Hawk stood before a group of teenagers, his tattooed hands clasped in front of him. The ink on his knuckles, once symbols of his past life, now seemed like relics from another time. "I was angry," he said, his gravelly voice soft but clear. "Spent 30 years running from myself, thinking the road would fix what was broken inside me." He paused, meeting the eyes of each teen. Some looked away, others stared back with defiance. "But sometimes the things we're running from aren't what we think they are." A boy in the back, maybe 16, shifted in his plastic chair. His dark hoodie was pulled low over his eyes, but Hawk could see him listening intently. "Then one day I found these two kids on the side of the road." Hawk's voice grew warmer. "Mason, he was 7, carrying his baby sister like she was made of glass, and somehow they saw something in me I couldn't see myself." The boy in the hoodie raised his head slightly. Hawk noticed the fresh bruise near his jaw. After the session, while other teens filed out, the boy lingered. He approached Hawk slowly, hands stuffed deep in his pockets. "That thing you said," he mumbled, "about running away not fixing things." "Yeah?" Hawk turned to face him fully. "I'm Jake. I've been—" He swallowed hard. "My old man, he drinks. Gets mean. I was thinking about taking off, but—" Hawk recognized the fear in Jake's eyes, the same fear he'd carried at that age. "But you're worried about your mom, siblings?" Jake nodded, a tear escaping despite his effort to hide it. "Got 2 little sisters." Hawk placed a gentle hand on Jake's shoulder. "Listen, son. Running away might feel like the only option, but there are people who can help. Let me make some calls." "Why would you help me?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because someone helped me. Hawk replied, and sometimes that's all it takes to break the cycle. Later that evening, Hawk pulled into his driveway, his old pickup groaning to a stop. The cabin windows glowed warm against the darkening sky. Through the kitchen window, he could see Mason setting the table, while Edie helped Rosie in her high chair. Before he could reach the porch, Mason burst through the door, waving something in his hand. "Dad, wait! Close your eyes!" Hawk chuckled and obliged, feeling Mason's small hands press something into his palms. "Okay, open them." It was a homemade card, decorated with careful crayon drawings. A big figure in black stood holding hands with two smaller figures. Above them, written in Mason's best handwriting, were the words, "Thanks for choosing me." Hawk's throat tightened. He looked at Mason's eager face, saw the pure love shining in those eyes. This boy who had once been a stranger on a dusty road was now his son in every way that mattered. "Miss Edie helped me make it," Mason explained proudly. "It's for Father's Day. Do you like it?" Hawk knelt down, pulling Mason into a tight hug. He thought about Jake at the shelter, about cycles of pain and healing, about choices that change lives. "I love it, buddy," he managed to say, "but you got it wrong in one part." Mason pulled back, looking worried. "You chose me first," Hawk said softly. "Remember? You called me your angel before I even knew who I could be." The winter sun cast long shadows through the cabin windows as Mason carefully balanced on a wooden stool, his small hands gripping the carved cross. Edie stood behind him, ready to catch him if he stumbled. Rosie sat on a blanket nearby, happily tangling tinsel in her tiny fingers. "A little higher on the left," Edie suggested, her gentle voice carrying across the warm room. The fireplace crackled, sending the scent of burning pine through the air. Hawk watched from the kitchen doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, a smile tugging at the corners of his weathered face. The cabin had changed so much in the past few months. Gone were the stark walls and empty spaces. Now, paper snowflakes hung from strings across the ceiling, and a small Christmas tree twinkled in the corner. "There," Mason declared triumphantly as he positioned the cross above the fireplace. The words carved into the wood caught the light. "Every saint has a past. Every sinner has a future." Hawk's throat tightened. He'd watched Mason work on that cross for weeks, sanding the wood smooth during their evening workshop sessions. The boy had insisted on carving the letters himself, though Hawk had guided his small hands with the tools. "It's perfect," Edie said, helping Mason down from the stool. She caught Hawk's eye and smiled knowingly. They both understood the deeper meaning behind those words. Rosie wobbled to her feet, clutching a strand of silver tinsel. "Papa," she called out, toddling toward Hawk with her arms raised. He scooped her up, and she pressed her tiny palm against his cheek, leaving a streak of glitter. "Look what you've done, princess," he chuckled, not bothering to wipe it away. "Now I'm sparkling like one of those fancy ornaments." Mason ran to the kitchen and returned with the paper chain he'd made at school. Red and green loops dangled from his hands. "Can we put this up too? Mrs. Thompson showed us how to make them." "Of course we can, buddy," Hawk said, setting Rosie down. He lifted Mason onto his shoulders, letting him drape the chain along the wooden beams while Edie steadied the ladder. The cabin filled with the smell of roasting turkey and sweet potatoes. Their first Christmas dinner together was almost ready. Hawk had never been much for holidays before, but now the joy in the children's eyes made everything different. When the timer chimed, they gathered around the small table. Candles flickered in mason jars, and paper plates carried careful drawings of snowmen and reindeer, Mason's artistic touch. Rosie sat in her high chair, wearing the tiny Christmas dress Edie had found at the church donation box. "Should we say grace?" Mason asked, reaching for Hawk's hand on one side and Edie's on the other. Rosie completed the circle, her small fingers wrapped around their hands. Hawk cleared his throat, unused to leading prayers but knowing this moment mattered. His voice came out rough but sincere. "Lord," he began, "thank you for this food. Thank you for bringing us together, for second chances, for love that finds us even when we think we don't deserve it." He squeezed Mason's hand gently. "And thank you for these little angels who showed this old biker what really matters. Amen." "Amen," Mason echoed cheerfully. "Amen," Rosie mimicked, making them all laugh. The morning sun filtered through frost-covered windows, casting a golden glow across the cabin's worn wooden floor. Hawk sat in his favorite armchair, watching Mason arrange presents under their modest Christmas tree. The boy had insisted on wrapping everything himself, resulting in packages that looked like they'd survived a small tornado. But the pride in Mason's eyes made the crooked paper and tangled ribbons perfect. Rosie sat on her play blanket nearby, surrounded by soft toys Edie had brought over. Her dark curls had grown, now forming tiny ringlets that bounced when she moved. She played with her favorite stuffed rabbit, one that still carried the pharmacy price tag from that first desperate shopping trip that felt like a lifetime ago. "Look, she's trying to stand up again," Mason whispered excitedly, pausing his present arranging. Hawk leaned forward, his weathered hands ready to catch her if she stumbled. Rosie grabbed the edge of the coffee table, her tiny fingers gripping the wood as she pulled herself up. Her face scrunched in concentration, showing the same determination he'd seen in her brother. Then she let go. One wobbly step, then another. Hawk's heart caught in his throat as she turned toward him, arms outstretched, her eyes locked with his, filled with complete trust. "Da," she started, her voice soft but clear. "Dada." The word hit him like a physical force. Hawk felt his chest tighten as Rosie toddled those final steps toward him, still calling "Dada" with increasing confidence. He scooped her up just as her legs began to wobble, holding her close. Her small hands patted his cheeks, now wet with tears he hadn't realized were falling. "Dada," she said again, as if she'd known the word all along and had just been waiting for the right moment. Mason scrambled over, wrapping his arms around them both. "She said it! She really said it!" His excitement was contagious, but Hawk could barely speak. All those years of running, of believing he wasn't worthy of love or redemption, of thinking his hands were too stained to ever hold something so pure, they all fell away with that one word. Dada, Father, a title he never thought he'd hear, let alone deserve. Rosie snuggled into his chest, her favorite position since that first night. Her brother leaned against his shoulder, warm and solid and real. Through blurry eyes, Hawk looked at the cross Mason had carved, hanging proud above the fireplace. "I need some air," he managed to say, kissing Rosie's forehead and setting her gently in Mason's care. "Just for a minute." He stepped onto the porch, the winter air sharp in his lungs. Snow fell in lazy spirals, covering everything in clean white. The empty space where his Harley used to sit was now filled with Mason's bike and Rosie's tiny red wagon. Christmas lights twinkled along the eaves, Edie's touch, and smoke curled from the chimney where a warm fire waited. Looking at the transformed cabin, Hawk remembered the lonely man who once lived here, surrounded by silence and ghosts. Now, through the window, he could see his children playing, could hear their laughter even through the glass. The cabin glowed with life and love and possibility. "Guess even angels can retire," he whispered to the falling snow, a real smile, full and unguarded, spreading across his face. I hope you liked this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.